So, Purim is around the corner, and it wouldn't be right if we went into Purim without discussing something relating to Purim here beforehand. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about an interesting inyan relating to the halachas of Purim. And of course, I recommend checking out the stuff I've done in the previous years. I'm not going to list them all, but you can look them up. This year I want to talk a bit about the halacha that you find in Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Megillah, Siman Tafresh Peiches, Din Krachim Hamukafim Chaimam Yimais Yeshua Ben Nun. Right? So we know this Purim, the Shushan Purim, surely we all know at least that. So if you look in Siman Tafresh Peiches, the Beis Yosef, the Mechaber writes just a few short points. Siv Aleph, Krachim Hamukafim Chaimam Yimais Yeshua Ben Nun, Afilu Einam Mukafim Achshav, if they had a wall in the days of Yeshua, even if now there's no wall, but there's still a city there. Kaidim b'Tezvav, so their proper day of Purim is the day after everyone else's. It's on Tezvav. Afilum heim b'chutz la'aretz, doesn't matter, it's on an Eretz Yisrael dika thing. So if you have a city in chutz la'aretz that you know goes back to that date and had a wall, Tezvav, Shushan Purim. V'hu shehuka v'achar kach yashav, gets into the technicalities of you have to ascertain that the wall was there at the right time. That's the halacha. Beis, v'chein hakfarim hanira mimohem. It's not just those cities, but also you have the concept, the term samuch v'nira, locations that are nearby, either samuch or nira, whatever the definition is. That's what he covers in Siv Beis, and he adds ubeshushan, called Shushan Purim, and Shushan itself, as it happens, Shushan itself did not have, no one's claiming that it had a wall all the way back then. But of course, that's where Shushan Purim happened, so that's where the Nes happened, so of course we read on Tezvav in Shushan. Shushan, we're assuming, is still a place, it's still there. Gimel, Kfarim Ayaras Gedoylas, Stam, a big city, Krachim Shein Makafim, Kfarim Ayaras Gedoylas, Krachim Shein Makafim Chaim Meis Yeshua Benun, Kainim B'Yadal, but any other city, seemingly, that didn't have a wall, you read on Yadalad like everyone else, like most of us do. Siv Daled, Krach Shu Safik Im Hukaf B'Mei Yeshua. What if you're not sure? He doesn't define and explain how we might be sure or not be sure, and that's going to be important. But he says it's a Safik, Kaidem B'Yudaled, Ubetazvav, Ubelelehoin. You read it on both days, both nights, 4 times. But the bracha shall only be made the first day Yudalit, like everyone else. Like the Mechaber says. That's where the discussion of this inyan ends. Then he goes into the questions of Ben Krach, went from here to there and back. It all sounds very simple. But if you're following the news, following the headlines from this year, from previous years, so you may have noted that this is actually a halachic inyan that causes a great tumult and a great shturim every year with people arguing different sides. And so here, for example, is news mamish from last week. It was reported in a number of places. I'm quoting here from Makor Rishon. That a headline, joining Yerushalayim, the Rav of Lud decided that Purim in Lud should be celebrated only on Tezvav. Shimon Biton has this surprising psak in which he's saying that Lud should shift over to Tezvav only, not Yadalit. Today, the standard minig in Lud is to observe both Yadalit and Tezvav. This was from last week, Tes Adar. And the article goes at length. It says, Rav Shimon Biton, he's the Rav, he's the Rabbanut rabbi of Lud. As they mentioned towards the end, he's also a member of the Chabad community, which makes it interesting. So he released a psak. There are images of the psak out there in which he makes this decision. He announces his decision that in his view, which should be only Tezvav. They quote him, Higati lemaskana brura v'chaluta ki ha'ir Lud hi ha'ir Lud ha'atika. So what's the question? As we'll see, the Gemara mentions Lud as one of the places where you should lay on Tezvav. The Shaila was only, is Lud now the same Lud that you had then? Because as we know in Eretz Yisrael, obviously Eretz Yisrael has a history that goes back many thousands of years, Jewish history, Bayis Rishon, pre-Bayis Rishon, Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, post-Bayis Sheni. And there are a lot of very, very ancient historical sites, and there are a lot of places that have ancient names, but we're not always 100% certain that a city that has a name is the same place, the exact same place that it was in 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And we know Trefzich, we know just from the reality on the ground in different locations that ancient cities tend to get destroyed. There was war, etc. And often they were rebuilt, but not necessarily in the exact same site as the previous city. Obviously, with Purim, you also have the din of Samach Venera, so you have to be arguing, presumably, that it was rebuilt, somewhat, quite a distance, a mile down or more from the original location. But that seems to be fairly common and fairly reasonable, that just because the place has a name doesn't automatically mean that it's the same place that you read about in the Svarim. But Rabbi Riton is coming to the conclusion, he got to the maskana that Ha'ir Lud today, he Ha'ir Lud Ha'atika. So in view of that, we should be celebrating only on Tezvav. However, he didn't get the agreement of the Rabbanim Rashiyim, and he's working for the Rabbanut, so he doesn't have the shtempel. So for now, he's still saying they should keep the minhag of celebrating both days. But he's gearing, he's trying to push things towards perhaps Taka celebrating only on Tezvav. Right, the Gemara itself mentions Lud, it quotes the Gemara, Lud v'oinoi v'gei achershem u'kafes choymim mimois Yeshua b'nun hava. So it is enough in the Gemara that mentions Lud, so that we're starting with that. It's not like other places, which as we shall see, Melchatchila, there's no mucker, but we can create our own sveikas and say, well, maybe it's an ancient city, maybe it had a wall, maybe it had a wall in time Yeshua b'nun. Here the Gemara actually says, Lud is on the list. The shaila is whether Lud today is the same Lud. And there's a halachic backstory. So Lud has only been around, apparently. Lud, the modern city of Lud, has only been around really for the last 100 years or so they say. I didn't go and fact check that. I know that 2 years ago I spoke about a similar but different shaila of Yom Tov Sheni, where you celebrate Yom Tov Sheni, and according to the Rambam, it doesn't automatically work with Eretz Yisrael 1 day, Chutz La'aretz 2 days. Really in Eretz Yisrael, the new cities that weren't around at the time by a Sheni, should also have a Yom Tov Sheni. And I spoke about Ramallah, which is near Lud, and it's interesting, each city in Israel really has its own interesting history, Jewish history, Arab history, destroyed, rebuilt. But for the purposes of this article, they're saying Lud has been around. Lud, as we know, has been around for the last 100 years, or even less, or the Jewish city of Lud. So the assumption was from the beginning that this is not biblical Lud. Shmuel Salant said that there's more than one Lud. However, in the last, what's happening now, what's changing, what's shifting? The last many decades, archaeologists have been digging around Lud, and they're arguing that we see that there's many, many layers of going back, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. We see almost consistent presence right in this location, so therefore they want to argue that this is the historic Lud. Rabbi Baton said he went along with the mayor and the archaeologists, and they toured the archaeological sites, and he finds it very convincing and persuasive that we see literally all from the Ottoman era, from the prehistoric era, from the prehistoric to the Ottoman era, by Yisrushin, etc. We see that in fact, they're even speculating that the Gemara mentions the Maisa of the Tanner Shalach Noi. So they dafka found, when they dug, they found these ancient furnaces, and they're speculating maybe we even found a Tanner Shalach Noi from the Gemara. Okay. So Rav Yosef, the Rav Rashi, he also seems to be swayed by the archaeology, but his take on it was that yes, there's a minhag. The minhag is already in place to celebrate too. We're not going to change the minhag, but everyone should know that he also agrees that the second day is really the ikr, and the first day is mitzvah the minhag. Not like other places where maybe the suffix is shvacher, and you say the first day is the real day, and the second day is the suffix mitzvah minhag. No, the second day is the real one, and the first is mitzvah minhag. So that's what Rav Yosef said. Rav Ton seems to want to go even further. Right, surprisingly, he's a Chabad Chassid. Chabad, they say, is the only community in Lud that has been ignoring this whole minhag the whole time and only celebrates Yadalit and ignores Tezvav entirely. Archaeology, garnished, we're not greatest against Tezach. So interesting that this is Dafka of Beton. There's also a Chlal. Archaeology is, we hear it's a triggering word. Religion, Yiddishkeit, has an uncertain relationship with archaeology and what can be derived and deduced and decided and concluded from that type of study and research. So that's certainly a part of it. It's very easy for Rabbanim Charedim just to say, you know what, let's just not be Geras archaeology and make life easier. Obviously, these Rabbanim are more open to that. So that's what's going on. That's the background. Literally, like I said, this past week, ongoing, and there have been contrasim and debates about Lud going on for the last couple of years. Now, really, when you get to it, the whole concept of Shushan Purim is not necessarily a very fully straightforward, clear concept. What's the Indian of Shushan Purim? What's its relationship to these different places? Where did these sveikas come from? Who came up with these sveikas? Who came up with these minhagim? And if you look at it historically, you see that it's not just one direct line. It's not a linear thing. Minhagim in different places at different times developed in different directions over the last 1,000 years. Obviously, you have the Gemara, and then you have what we know from different locations in the last 1,000 years. Right, just the basic facts are, right, we celebrate Shushan Purim as you celebrate Tezvav, beside the Megillah, beside all the other mitzvahs, in Shushan, without Chatchila, where the Nes of Shushan Purim happened, the only city today that's considered to be a Vada is Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim is the one location where it's really hard to lose the geographical spot and say, I'm not sure where Yerushalayim is. I mean, we have so many very, very major landmarks in Yerushalayim that it's hard to lose, hard to miss that. But all the other places mentioned in the Gemara, etc., or places that people came up with later, are all gather Suffolk and they celebrate too. I'm not sure what's left of the Jewish community in Shushan today, if anything, and I don't know if there's really continuity of the minhag there, but like you saw from the Beis Yosef, I think we know that historically there was a community in Shushan near is it even the historic site? I don't know, but there's we know that the palace, Achashverosh's palace in Shushan, has been excavated. Archaeologists have found it. There are inscriptions there, etc. I think that's not quite in the city itself, but I just saw that there are those who want to argue from Pshat in the Megillah itself that Shushan Habira and Ha'ir Shushan are not quite the same thing. Shushan Habira means Shushan the palace. Bira is a palace. That's the location of Achashverosh. Usually the palace could be its own sort of it's a suburb of the city. And Ha'ir Shushan, that's where the Yidden lived, etc. So I haven't researched the historicity of the city of Shushan, but clearly, like I said, from the Mechaber, it just sounds like he's talking about Shushan as a realistic place, and I definitely have heard the Chlolos that there was a community in Shushan. I believe they celebrated Shushan Purim. So you have that, you have Yerushalayim, because that's a Vada, and everything else is a Suffolk. Why Bechlal? Where does the whole B'mois Yeshua Ben Nun thing come from? So the quote of Yerushalmi, the Bava just gives a drasha. It says, Yerushalmi says that clearly Chachamim wanted to include more cities in celebrating Shushan Purim, and if you made it Yaris B'Kafas Chayma Mimais Shushan Purim, so no cities in Eretz Yisrael will be included because Eretz Yisrael was destroyed at the time. There were no cities with walls in Eretz Yisrael then. So it'd be a busha. Many other cities might be on the list because you're starting much later, but Eretz Yisrael itself wouldn't be. That would be disrespectful. So instead, they went with Yeshua Ben Nun, and that can include that gives an emphasis towards Eretz Yisrael. If you look at it from a historical perspective, you can look up, Wikipedia has a list of ancient cities by date. There aren't that many necessarily ancient cities, especially in our part of the world. There are a few that are especially continuous, so we can say this is the site of the city. Dafka in Greece, you have a couple, and we know from elsewhere there were places in Greece where they had this minhag, Taka, Misafik. So this is some of the information we're working with here. Everything else, you have these cities in Eretz Yisrael, like I said, maybe they're mentioned in the Gemara. Then you have random cities in Turkey and Greece where the minhag at some point became that, this feels like an ancient city. We don't have exact today, we have Wikipedia. Back then they didn't. They were working more on rumors, shmuas, estimates, but people had the sense of a certain place that this place feels like it might have been around since Yeshua Ben Nun. It might have had a wall, unclear even how much information you need to have in order to create a suffix, which we should be getting to. But different sveikas arose. There even were cities in Europe that, Prague, there are some occurrences that say that in Prague they decided that there's a suffix, even though if you look at the history up today, Western Europe or even Eastern Europe, but not except Greece. Greece is like in the Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, but if you go more west, all this, the whole culture, civilization in Europe has only been around since the time of the Romans, since the time of Ayasheni. There really isn't much to speak of. Of course, you can always speculate what the prehistoric nomadic tribes were up to, but Pashtos, not much going on. As we'll see, the Levush essentially said pretty clearly that you should not have any sveikas regarding Europe. But as we see, despite that, in Prague, they decided there is a suffix. So this is some of the halacha and history that's necessary to know in order to approach this topic. Part of the Shiur today might also be based on Samach Venera. Is it Samach Venera to a certain place, even if it's not the place itself? So there's Machlekes, Mishnah Brura Chazon Ish. Mishnah Brura says if you're just smuchas to a suffix, then you just read on your Dalet. And the Chazon Ish said no. If you have a city that has a minig misafik, so the order Masmuchas should also be created misafik. That expands the map of suffix Shushan Purim tremendously, depending who you follow. Like I said, there's much more, and each location has its own history. And now we're seeing that there are those who want to argue that no, we have another location that has a vadai, that Lud should be treated as a vadai. So that's very interesting. Now, instead of tackling the whole subject from beginning to end, which is not within the scope of the shiur, I want to focus on interesting halachic shakla v'tarya, fairly obscure from the last 100 years, which could serve as a sort of extreme example, an extreme test of the question of what is a suffix, what is the standard, what is the barometer, what is the bar for a suffix when we say there's a suffix. We find this in Shut Mishpatei Uziel. Now, there's different numbering. It's called Tinyana, but it's also called Krach Gimel. Eire Chaim Siman Vav. Mishpatei Uziel was Rabbi Sion Meir Chai Uziel, lived from the 1880s to the 1950s, passed away in 1953. He was the second Rishon LeZion and Avarashi Sfardi in Israel, a major Rav in his time. He actually was born in Yerushalayim to a Sfardi family. There was an ongoing Sfardi presence, of course, in Eretz Yisrael for many hundreds of years. He was influenced by very early religious Zionism, like very early, 1850s, 70s, very early. There were early Zionist voices within the Sephardi world as well. He became Rishon LeZion in 1939, and he had the position until his passing in 1953, back when there was a lifetime appointment. So in this Krach Gimel, Tinyana, Eire Chaim Siman Vav, there's a tshuva from Gimel of Tafresh Tzadik Vav, 1936, addressed to Kavoid Harav Goyin HaMafersim Harav Reb Yitzchok Al-Gazi Rav Umotz L'Kehilas HaSfardim Be'ir Montevideo. Montevideo, of course, if we have South Americans here, I'm sure they know, Montevideo is a city in Uruguay. Uruguay is a country in South America on the east coast. I think right below Brazil. Okay, so that's already interesting. So we're talking essentially about a location in the Americas. Now, how long have Jews been in Montevideo? So if you look it up, Wikipedia, history of the Jews in Uruguay, so apparently some Jews fleeing the Inquisition already arrived there as early as the 1500s. The Inquisition, even though it was active in other locations in South America, we know that Jews arrived in Brazil very early on and then enjoyed freedom there under the Dutch, and then the Spanish came and reconquered it. I believe, either the Spanish or the Portuguese, but it was reconquered, and the Inquisition arrived, and all the Jews had to leave, but there was a full-fledged from community with a Rav, a Chashav Rav, in Brazil, Mamish, very, very early on, for a brief period of time. So there were, I guess, sporadic Jews who arrived there early where the Inquisition wasn't as active, but when we speak of the community in Uruguay, Montevideo, it starts somewhere in the 1800s after the Inquisition. People don't necessarily know. The Inquisition was still functioning to some extent or another through the beginning of the 1800s, so past the Baal Shem Tov, around till the time of the Alter Rebbe, Inquisition was still a thing. I've seen different dates about when the last public burning of a Jew was, but fairly late. So from the 1800s, that's when, also modern history essentially, that's when immigration to the Americas starts beginning in earnest. A lot of Ashkenazim, Sephardim too. Montevideo was the largest location. By 1909, there were 150 Jews. The first minyan opened in 1912. The first shul opened in 1917, an Ashkenazi shul. They opened schools in the 20s. And the big immigration took place in the 20s and the 30s, so this tshuva is from 1936. Who's it to? Al-Ghazi. Who's that? Tried looking it up. Sure enough, if you search Isaac Al-Ghazi, so he has a large footprint online, mainly because he was actually a very musical individual, known more as a chazan, and there actually are a lot of recordings of his, and for those interested in that part of Jewish history, Jewish musical history, so apparently he's a valuable resource and an important person in that world. But there's a lengthy article singing his praises on some Turkish website, and they mention that his life story. Isaac Al-Ghazi was born in Turkey. Already was known for being a very musical person back then. They also emphasized that he was called rabbi wherever he had a position. They did call him rabbi, so that I guess would fit with how Uziel is referring to him. He's not just Stam Chazan. And then in 1935, he did in fact end up in Montevideo. At that point, there was a large community of expats, of Turkish Jews in Izmir, which is where he was from. So he was joining the diaspora of his community in Montevideo in Uruguay. That's where that's the background for the question. And it doesn't get emphasized immediately, but it's worth emphasizing. The Jews in Izmir kept 2 days of Purim. So that probably is a factor in how this question came to be. So he says, Demar. And also it makes sense that there's some kind of familiarity connection with Uziel and Isaac Al-Ghazi, I guess ran in overlapping circles, so there was some familiarity there. So Demar, you're so humble, you're asking me to answer the following shilas, and there are 9 questions, and some of them are a little more nebachdik. You would associate with questions in America. What do you do with burial when non-Jews and Jews are intermarried? Can you bury the non-Jews in the Jewish cemetery? Can you bury the Jews in the intermarriage in the Jewish cemetery? Some of those questions. But the first questions are more interesting. The first question is, what's the story with Meir Datal, Meir Dagashem in the southern hemisphere? Apparently the minig at that time in this community was that they just never said Meir Dagashem at all. Because once you say it, so they just didn't say it at all. They said Meir Datal again Shiur. On Shmini Atzeres and Pesach, they did Tfilas Tal and Tfilas Gashem. That they did. But otherwise, also they have different nuschais for Baruch Aleinu. They have the nusach where during the winter it's one nusach, the whole Baruch Aleinu, Barchenu, Baruch Aleinu. So they just went with the summer nusach Gans Yar. So he's asking Uziel, is that correct? So Uziel addresses that. Second question. Inyan Shushan Purim. Payesh machlekes im tzarech lasas yom echad or shnei yomim haPurim. Why? One side of the suffix. L'pnei America loy ha'isen nimtzis b'mei Yeshua. So when I was reading it, I was like, that's a funny way of explaining. So why would you think that you should? But again, if they're coming from Izmir, and that's the minig, so to them, Pashtos Purim was a 2-day affair. And they're coming to a new city, Yiddishkeit to them is a 2-day Purim. But now others are saying, what are you talking about? America, so that's the only part that needs to be explained. Obviously we should be keeping 2. You want to explain to me why not? Oh, America wasn't around then. Okay? So should we count it as a muk of chayma? That was the question Rav Uziel quotes back. So this is what Rav Uziel answered. Rav Uziel said, in your Mikra Megillah, you had the suffix, whether to read 2 days misafik or just one. So he begins by quoting the Lavush that I alluded to before. The Lavush wrote, "B'mdinas Eila Einless Topic." He's referring to Europe as we think of it. "B'mdinas Eila Einless Topic Lefi Sheheim B'Tzofen U'Rechaykim Eretz Yisrael V'Yadua Shlei Hayom Yishavim B'Zman Yeshua." Lavush is saying a very sound historical fact that civilization didn't really arrive in Europe till around the Romans Mamash Bayasheni time. Surprisingly late. So Lavush said that. Okay. And he's Mitzayin also to the Bar Hetiv. Then Rav Uziel says, Avalani is daiti nire she'ein lahachlit al shum makam shevada lehayam and yushav b'mei Yeshua. Uziel says, who's to say about any place that was certainly not Yushav in Yeshua's days? V'toiv yoysa likris ha-megillah b'yadalad b'vracha uv'yom tazvav b'loy bracha keminha g'roiv ha'olam. He calls it Roiv ha'olam. Roiv ha'olam in Rav Uziel's book. Read the Megillah Yadalad and again on Tazvav B'lei Bracha. So continue the Minhag Roiv ha'olam into Montevideo, Uruguay as well, because who's to say? There's no certainty. No one has any certainty that a place was not Meyushiv. All right, and that seems essentially to be his, he doesn't spell it out fully, but that his barometer seems to be that you have to know with certainty that it was not Yeshua Yeshua. The moment, go prove a negative. How are you going to prove to me that Montevideo did not have a city with walls b'mei Yeshua? You can't. Okay, so that's why Rov Ha'olam, according to Rav Zil, should keep 2 days, which he thinks is normal. He's saying that's been a Rov Ha'olam. And he goes on to the other questions. Like I said, there were 8 questions, right? But very surprising, shocking, not how we're used to thinking about it. Right? So according to Rav Zil, throughout North and South America, through all 5 boroughs, Borough Park, Flatbush, etc., we should all be keeping 2 days of Purim. Now, if you actually want to look up the history, you can look up Wikipedia history of Uruguay. So we know there were some parts of the Americas. The Aztecs had cities. There's different interesting histories of the natives. As it happens in Uruguay, the way it's described is that 4,000 years ago, certain tribes arrived there. It never reached more than 10,000 to 20,000 people. They lived in small tribes of nomadic, so literally small groups, nomadic, moving around. Never reached more than 10 to 20,000 people in that general area. It is estimated there were about 9,000, I hope I don't mispronounce, Charua and 6,000 Chana and Guarani at the time of first contact with Europeans in 1500. So based on anything we know about Uruguay, there's certainly not much that sounds like walled Aztec cities, civilization in that sense, even if you want to talk about native civilization independently from our Western-centric narrative and history of civilization. Yeah, that's just if you want to get very technical and historical about it, the way the Levush essentially was, getting technical and historical. So this is a very interesting Mishnah B'tei Uzziel. It itself is not very well known, but I saw that there's actually Shakta V'Taya. There was someone who read it at the time, noticed it, and responded to it, and we have what he wrote, and that was of Meshulam Roth. Meshulam Roth lived from the 1870s to the 1960s. He was born in Galicia. He was a Rav later in Ukraine and in Romania. He was part of the Rabbanut HaRashit once he arrived in Israel. And his shut is called Shut Koma Vaser. He was actually in Romania during World War II. Romania had interesting history during World War II. Romania was never fully occupied. It was, though, part of the Axis. So the Jews that were in Romania proper and Bucharest, they were actually untouched, pretty much. Jews who were in other regions, Bukovina, etc., so a lot of them were exiled to Transnistria. They were dragged from their houses and dumped in this sort of no man's land between different countries. It was a very horrible time, but it's not quite the usual European Holocaust experience you're familiar with. Anyway, he was in, Chernovitz was a city which got exiled to Transnistria. But he was there at the time, but in 1943 they managed to bribe authorities. They smuggled him to Bucharest, which was safer, and then in 1944 he immigrated to Eretz Yisrael, joined the Rabbanut, etc. Then he retired, and then he passed away. He was associated with the Zionists as well, but apparently he was more respected even by anti-Zionist groups. I guess he had a very proper Haredi background. So in Shut Kol Mevaser, Chelek Aleph, Siman Samach Aleph, there's no date here, but as we'll see from elsewhere, he wrote this letter in the second half of Tafshin Yud. I didn't check when that Chelek Mishnah B'tei Uzziel was printed, but presumably, I would assume within a year before. So Mishnah B'tei Uzziel is printing his farm with his shuvas, and the Meshulam Roth is getting the sefer, and he's responding. So he writes to Yedidi, I'm looking at your Shut Mishnah B'tei Uzziel Madur Tanyana Chelek Arechaim that you sent me as a matana, and here are a few ha'aras. And his first ha'ara is on this shtickle, Simon Vav Tshuva Beis, about the skill in America, and he quotes the thing back. Now he says, the Magen Avraham also quoted the Levush. Right, the Levush maybe isn't as heavy in authority sometimes when you discuss Yana Erechaim, but the Magen Avraham is pretty big, and he also quotes the Levush. That's where we're familiar with this Vart from. Fine. So that's certainly not in faith. That's not going with Rav Zil's Mahalach. Rav Zil mentioned it. He mentioned the Levush, but Magen Avraham also. He says, I'm very surprised, though, that you didn't mention what the Beis Yosef cites. If you look, not in Mechaber, in the Beis Yosef, in Siman Tov Shpeicha, is there the Mechaber, the Beis Yosef Taka gets into this whole subject much more barichas, and he quotes, Das Harav Reb Yosef Abiyov. Now, let's putting this together, I was wondering who's Rabbi Yosef Abiyov. I mean, I know there's a Yitzchak Abuhov that the Rabbi Yosef quotes a lot. Is that a mistake? But no, apparently there was some individual from the Spanish exile community whose name was Rabbi Yosef Abiyov. Mechaber quotes him here. When you search the name, a lot of stuff from Purim. You got a lot of hits from Purim. So that's what maybe his claim to fame, that he had this statement to make on this subject. Rabbi Yosef Abiyov said, what's a suffix? This question, what is a suffix? When the Rambam said, the Rambam codified, he wrote, Shekayrim bebeis hayomim, bekrach shu suffix. What's a krach shu suffix? He said, the Mechaber quotes him, there's an actual disagreement with two parties very certain about their position. Some say mukafas, and some say ain't mukafas. It wasn't mukafas chamim Yeshua. That's where your doubt arose from, because some said azoi and some said azoi. If you only had those saying this, you wouldn't have a suffix in that direction, or vice versa. But here you have a disagreement. I don't know what to do. That's a suffix. But if you have no idea at all, one mikri suffix. That's not a suffix. What are you unsure about? You don't know anything. And he brought an interesting, surprising Geshmak Araya from Hilchas Shgagas. Hashem Badai, Hashem Taloi. When do you bring an Hashem Taloi? You have a suffix. What's the definition of a suffix? Same question. So, Shteit in the Rambam, I mean, you can eat anything and convince yourself that what if it was treif? I think maybe it was treif. Is that how you create a suffix? No, it's not the Rambam. Ad sheyeh sham isser kavua. There has to have been a known isser that was present there. And now the shaila is which one you ate. That's how you always describe the Hashem Taloi, and there's a reason for that. That's a very necessary ingredient of the suffix of an Hashem Taloi. That was Rav Yosef Abiyuv's raya. So from here we see the Tzushtel to the Megillah. Stam here makafes choyma ve'en yoidim b'im makafes choyma meis Yeshua im lav lo'ibal leklal suffix klal. There's no suffix here yet. We only read on your knowledge who's man kriya l'roiv oilam. Here, back to the Mechaber, back to these sources that are of course saying that roiv oilam reads on one day. Now, the Beis Yosef, Shalom Roth, Kamavasa says, Taka, the Beis Yosef was doiche the raya. There's a whole shtak of Ataria that you can go off into on the Tzushtel to Hashem Toli and Shgagas. But he says, the Beis Yosef wrote afterwards, Mir yesh l'kayim dvara from the Ran. The Ran says that the whole Musik and Gemara, the Gemara already mentions that in certain locations, in Tveria, Hutzel, they read Misafik. Right? The Gemara has a list of places that they read Vadai, not just Yerushalayim, Lod, those other places. And then the Gemara also mentions that there were places that they read twice Misafik, which is where this whole concept originates from. So the way the Ran writes it is that it was Midas Chassidus. They didn't have to do both, it was Tama Midas Chassidus. And the way he describes it is that the Ran's Lashon, Lefi Shitasai, says, what kind of scenario had the Ran angehabt, what created the suffix in Gemara? That they were arguing, one said Azoi and one said Azoi. Mashma midvarav, the Beis Yosef said, from here we see it's a raya to Rabbi Yosef Abiyov that davka pekahai gavna, that's a suffix. Now, according to the Ran with the Goinim, it's Memidas Chassidus, and the equivalent position of the Rambam is that it's Medina, that you have to read Misafik Medina. But Papashus, the Rambam, is going along with the same categorization of the Ran as to what constitutes a suffix. But Kol She'em HaChlekes B'Kabbalasam Al She'en Anu Yoidim Im Himukafas Mimais Yeshua Im just have no information, lack of data, Loi Nichnas L'Klal Suffix V'Ein Kayin Ba'al Yadala Dovid HaKaram. The Beis Yosef continues and says that those who read Vidal B'Tazvav, B'chol ha'ayaris ha'mukafis, the problem is that already in the time of the Beis Yosef, there were a number of places in which it just looked like people were reading on 2 days, stam because they had a wall in their day, and they were just sort of saying, well, it's looks like a pretty hush of a city, maybe, we'd like to think that it goes back many thousands of years. Since there's actually a wall there, so that alone, move the bar a bit down and say, once there's a wall there, that's enough to create doubt in Himukafas Yemesi Yeshua. But that's still not the same as going to the other extreme. And then at the end, the Beis Yosef writes that he also got a Sefer Ashkenazi, a manuscript with Ashkenazi Mekayos, and there's a tshuva there that says the Kol Krochem Didan Koinem B'Yadalid. More that, you see that most of the cities I read on 2 days were more in the Sephardi area, the arena part of the world, and Ashkenazim mostly did not, with some notable exceptions. So Levush later, but this is even earlier, there's a tshuva that says, Kol krachim didan kainam yadalet, ilav de kimlon shemukafes b'meis yishlas. We know for sure, oy kesveika de tveria, v'hotzo de tali b'sveika de dino, shenech luka b'kabalasam, also using the shenech luka b'kabalasam. So Zok the Mishalom Roth, so it sounds like the Beis Yosef, you omitted this whole discussion, this very, very direct mucker for this question. You omitted it from your tshuva to Montevideo. And my reading of the Beis Yosef is that ultimately, even though he disagreed on the Raya from Shraga, the Beis Yosef hiskim ledina to this statement, to this view that there has to be episa yisoid to the suffix, not just I don't know anything. He's been signed to the Bir Hagra. As another makar, another raya, so he says, "V'lachem dinas rechaykes in America, shadas neita yoser, shaloi hayum yeshavas b'mei Yeshua." A place like America, why would you think that there was something there? Pshita sheish lifsek, Dr. Mishalom Roth kadas alavush from Magen Avram that said that b'mdinas elu no safek l'kliyama in karanak b'yadalet. Then he goes off and says that he has his own shaklavatari on the Beis Yosef, l'gabe hilchos shragas, etc. Then he goes on to comment on other surprising things he found in Mishpatei Yisrael and that shuv and other shuvas. Now, in recent years, it turns out that Rav Uziel, as we say in Ivrit, lo nishar chayav. He answered, he responded, he didn't give Rav Mishalom Roth the last word. This is in Mishpatei Uziel, and again, Badura Tlisa, Chelik Ches. Apparently was printed for the very, very first time, a little over 20 years ago, Yushalayim Tafshin Samach Aleph, Miksav Yad HaMechaber, as Mordechai writes the Divrei Bracha. We're very happy that we have these choshevet shuvas. So in Simon Samach Aleph, there's a response from Chav Ches Shvat Tavshin Yud Aleph to Agoyin Agodol Mefirst from Shalom Roth Chaver Rabbanut Reshut Eretz Yisrael. He says, "I'm sorry that I only got around to responding to your wonderful artist now." And he writes your artist from Yud Gimel Sivan Tavshin Yud. So from Sivan to Shvat, took him a while to get back to him. But he acknowledges that. I'm going to try to respond. So, Simavav Shiva Beis, what I wrote, what you wrote. You mentioned that. What about the Magen Avram? Right off the beginning, why didn't you mention the Magen Avram? So, yeah, I was signed to the Bar Hatev. The Bar Hatev is citing the Magen Avram. He says, Grada, I don't think necessarily that the Magen Avram was masking to the Levush, because in the same Magen Avram he also quotes the Shalah, and the Shalah wrote, B'chutz la'aretz, yesh krachim shiroi le'estabek behem. And that sounds like he's disagreeing with the Levush who said, B'mdinas elu ein le'estabek. Magen Avram cited both. So who says the Magen Avram is even on your side? But then you asked me, what about the whole Hemda, Arichas of the Beis Yosef? So he says, if you look at my tshuva, you can see from the format of my tshuva that I wasn't getting at the shlakavatari. It's question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. He says, you could tell, Teva hadvarim hoyu mechayvim. It wasn't the time and the place to write ba'arichas, and if I try to be ma'arich in each one, there were 8 questions. Now, what was my point? He says, my point was the person asking said that because America wasn't around, as we, colloquially we say, it wasn't around time of Yeshua. So I said, that who's to say it wasn't? You want to say it wasn't? To them zagech, who's to say? But I don't know. And therefore, we should do what I call, I'm adding, but K'min Agrei V'Olam. Again, he invokes K'min Agrei V'Olam. So obviously, what I'm saying is, of course, the Ikar Kriyas be a Dalid, but it's also good to read on Tasva B'Lei Bracha, K'min Agrei V'Olam. And of course, it's not Mamish Medina, it's a minik. And by the way, he says, your reading of the Beis Yosef, what the Beis Yosef's maskana and that whole shtickle there is, that he's pasking like a Beis Yosef, he disagreed, he upgefragt his rayas. Yeah, at the end he quoted that Sefer Ashkenazi, but he also, last we heard, he was Deiche his rayas, so, and then he goes on and wants to say that it's Meduik in the Shulchan Aruch. How does the Shulchan Aruch write it? Shulchan Aruch writes, Kvarim ha'yaris she'en mekafim chayma kaidem b'yadalet. Krach shu safek im hukaf kaidem b'yadalet. So he wrote, the first sentence was, Kvarim ha'yaris she'en mekafim. So it sounds like, only when you know that it's a vada. How do you know she'en mekafim? Must be you have certainty. And when you have certainty, ein kaidem. Masha ain't kind of it's a suffix. From here is mashma that everything else, by definition, by default, is a suffix. So he wants to read it straight into the Lashon HaMechaber in Shulchan Aruch. And he quotes from the Radbaz and the Chidah that mentioned different places where Pashtus there wasn't even reason to think there was a suffix, but the minhag was to read on both. So he says his understanding is the Divri Akarel mutav likra yudal bevracha b'tezvav b'lei bracha. If it was up to him, yeah, everywhere in the world, Batsim should. And what he already sees as minhag Rev Olam, I guess within that pre-modern Eretz Yisrael, I guess most cities in Eretz Yisrael perhaps had this minhag, and a number of notable cities in Turkey and Greece. So within that orbit, maybe Taka felt like Rev Olam, that was the normal way of celebrating Purim. Let's just conclude over here. He says, I want to add, because of course we have many other big kehillas in America from the last few decades, and it's not just limited to America, for many countries. It's not a brand new kid, didn't just open this year. And here he reveals, I think with the basis really of this whole discussion, here is where he acknowledges that that's where they were coming from. They were coming from that minhag, and they brought that minhag in, they transplanted the minhag here. And now someone's trying to come and undermine the minhag. So you're going to come and say to only read on your Dalet, so we're passing their old minhag, we're confusing people. Mishum kach matzasi l'toy v'nachotz, to just say b'ktzarek halacha psuka. And it says, in my opinion, that's when you, the kind of thing you say about makim she'amru lekatzer, tarash l'hayrech. Then he goes off and discusses the hilchos Shragas discussion. Just want to conclude for 30 seconds. One of the big authorities, one of the big voices on this topic, the contemporary question right now, is Rabbi Ephraim Ariel Buchwald. He wrote a kuntrus a few years ago, Hayam Ma'el in Iskarim. Perhaps Bli Neder off, not live. Perhaps I'll record the summary of his discussion if you want to get an understanding of a lot more of the halach and history. So in his kuntrus, he has a small section where he says, "Hahezber shel Rav Zil kol makim hu safek." Within the whole context, especially when you see what everyone else has said on the topic, Rav Zil Shita really does stand out. He does seem to be the only person to have ever tried attempting to state it that way. He quotes Rav Zil referring to this also elsewhere in Mishpatei Zil, and his whole presentation is just incredulous. And where does Rav Zil getting this from? No one else ever said any such thing. And he quotes the first shuvah about America, and he's like, I can't believe that he said that. No one else would say such a thing. But I think, like I said, this is an extreme test that can help clarify how we even understand what constitutes a suffix when we say that that's a suffix, and with that we'll conclude for now.